The world's most elusive cartel boss has finally been sentenced to die in prison. The drug kingpin who avoided capture for decades has finally been sentenced to die in prison. For decades, Ismael El Mayo Zambada appeared to be the untouchable survivor of Mexico's cartel wars. Rivals were assassinated. Partners were captured. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán escaped from prison twice, became one of the world's most famous criminals, and was eventually extradited to the United States. Zambada remained free. He avoided the theatrical publicity associated with El Chapo, operated through trusted intermediaries, and relied on a formidable network of armed protection, political corruption, and personal loyalty. While other cartel leaders became international celebrities, El Mayo quietly helped transform the Sinaloa Cartel into a global trafficking empire. That extraordinary run has now reached its final conclusion. On July 20th, 2026, U.S. District Judge Brian Cogan sentenced the 76-year-old cartel leader to life imprisonment in a federal court in Brooklyn. Zambada was also ordered to forfeit $15 billion connected to the criminal organization he led for decades. He will almost certainly die inside an American prison. Who was Ismael El Mayo Zambada? Zambada was not merely another senior trafficker within the Sinaloa Cartel. He was one of its principal architects. Born in the Mexican state of Sinaloa, he rose through the drug trade during an era when trafficking groups were becoming increasingly sophisticated, international, and violent. He eventually became one of the dominant figures in the organization alongside El Chapo and other veteran traffickers from northwestern Mexico. The Sinaloa Cartel was never a conventional company with one undisputed chief executive. It functioned more like a federation of trafficking families, regional commanders, armed groups, money launderers, and corrupt officials. Zambada's power came from his ability to hold these competing interests together. American prosecutors described him as one of the cartel's principal leaders and a senior strategist who remained closely involved in its operations. During his 2025 guilty plea, Zambada admitted participating in a continuing criminal enterprise and a racketeering conspiracy. He also acknowledged that his organization used bribery and violence to protect its trafficking network. Prosecutors attributed more than 1.5 million kilograms of cocaine trafficking to the criminal operation he helped control. The cartel also distributed heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, while building routes extending through Latin America, the United States, Europe, and Asia. Zambada's importance was therefore not based solely on fear. It was based on infrastructure. The cartel developed aircraft routes, maritime operations, border tunnels, warehouses, financial networks, and distribution partnerships capable of moving drugs and money on an industrial scale. El Mayo helped keep that machinery running. How did he remain free for so long? Zambada's ability to avoid capture was one of the most remarkable features of his criminal career. Before his arrival in U.S. custody in July 2024, he had reportedly never spent time in prison. His survival appears to have depended on discipline, secrecy, and deep local protection. Unlike El Chapo, Zambada did not build his image around spectacular escapes or public notoriety. He rarely appeared in public and reportedly moved between remote strongholds protected by trusted guards and communities where the authorities struggled to operate. He also understood that corruption could be more effective than confrontation. At his guilty plea, Zambada admitted that bribes were paid to Mexican police officers, military personnel, and public officials. Such payments could allow shipments to pass through protected territory, investigations to be compromised, and warnings of law enforcement operations to reach cartel leaders before raids occurred. His decentralized leadership style provided another layer of protection. Regional commanders could manage their own trafficking routes while remaining connected to the broader cartel. Zambada did not need to appear personally at every negotiation or supervise every shipment. He became a hidden criminal executive rather than a visible battlefield commander. That distinction may explain why he survived, while so many others did not. His role inside the Sinaloa Cartel. Zambada's most important function may have been maintaining stability between powerful factions. The cartel contained numerous armed groups and trafficking families with their own commercial interests. Zambada possessed the seniority and relationships required to negotiate disputes and prevent every disagreement from turning into an internal war. His network became known as Los Mayos, or La Maiza. Its greatest internal rival was Los Chapitos, the faction controlled by El Chapo's sons. U.S. authorities have accused Los Chapitos of developing large-scale fentanyl production and using extreme violence against rivals, officials, and members of their own organization. Zambada represented an older model of cartel leadership, discreet, pragmatic, and built around long-term political protection. Los Chapitos embodied a more aggressive generation. The factions could cooperate when their interests aligned, but they were also competing for territory, trafficking corridors, and control over the wider organization. As long as El Mayo remained active, his authority helped contain that rivalry. His removal destroyed the balance. The extraordinary circumstances of his capture. Zambada's arrest was almost as extraordinary as his decades spent avoiding it. On July 25, 2024, a small aircraft carrying Zambada and Joaquín Guzmán López, one of El Chapo's sons, landed near Santa Teresa, New Mexico. American authorities immediately took both men into custody. The central mystery was how Zambada had ended up on the aircraft. Zambada claimed that Guzmán López had betrayed him. According to his account, he was invited to a supposed meeting, ambushed, restrained, and taken aboard the aircraft against his will. His lawyer characterized the episode as a kidnapping. Representatives associated with Guzmán López disputed that version and suggested the journey was voluntary. Mexican officials were not informed about the operation in advance, creating diplomatic tension and demands for an explanation from Washington. The precise circumstances remain contested. However, the strategic consequences were unmistakable. El Mayo's supporters believed the Guzmán family had delivered their leader to the United States. The fragile relationship between the cartel's major factions collapsed, turning political suspicion into open warfare. Why? The life sentence matters. The life sentence closes one of the longest and most important cartel prosecutions in U.S. history. Zambada belonged to the generation that transformed Mexican trafficking organizations into multinational criminal businesses. He survived successive waves of arrests, military operations, internal betrayals, and leadership changes. Now he joins El Chapo inside the American federal prison system. His former partner is serving life at the highly restrictive ADX Florence prison in Colorado. Zambada's lawyers have asked that he instead be placed in a facility capable of treating his age-related medical conditions. Prosecutors have resisted any placement that could allow him greater access to outside contacts. They argue that members of his faction remain active and that he could still possess the influence to communicate with cartel associates from prison. The $15 billion forfeiture judgment is also significant. Authorities may never recover the entire amount, particularly where assets have been hidden, transferred, or placed under the control of associates. However, the order gives the U.S. government a legal basis to pursue money and property connected to Zambada's organization. It also demonstrates the extraordinary wealth attributed to the Sinaloa Cartel's trafficking operation. Can the Sinaloa Cartel survive without its old leadership? The cartel is likely to survive. The more difficult question is whether it can remain a single organization. Zambada's capture triggered sustained fighting between La Maiza and Los Chapitos. A July 2026 International Crisis Group report described the conflict as a vicious struggle between rival Sinaloa factions that has continued since 2024. The war has damaged businesses, displaced families, and destabilized communities across Sinaloa. It has also demonstrated a recurring weakness in the strategy of removing dominant cartel leaders. Decapitation can disrupt command structures and expose criminal networks. It can also cause organizations to splinter into smaller, less predictable groups fighting over the territory left behind. Research and security analysis have repeatedly described this as a Hydra effect. Removing one leader can produce several competing successors rather than eliminating the organization itself. Sinaloa's trafficking infrastructure also extends far beyond any single individual. The cartel has spent decades building relationships with drug producers, transport operators, corrupt officials, money launderers, and distributors. Those connections do not automatically disappear because El Mayo and El Chapo are in prison. Los Chapitos can continue operating through their own commanders. Zambada's sons and veteran allies may preserve significant parts of La Maiza. Regional traffickers may become increasingly independent or adopt new identities while continuing to use the same routes. The Sinaloa Cartel could therefore survive as a collection of factions rather than a unified empire. The end of El Mayo, but not the cartel. Ismael Zambada spent decades proving that the most powerful criminal leaders are not always the most visible. He avoided the attention-seeking behavior that surrounded El Chapo, cultivated loyalty across generations, and remained hidden while directing one of the world's most successful drug trafficking networks. His freedom ultimately ended not through a conventional police raid, but through an apparent betrayal from within the cartel's own leadership. Whether he boarded the aircraft voluntarily or was kidnapped by the son of his former partner, the result is now permanent. El Mayo has been sentenced to spend the remainder of his life in an American prison. The old Kingpin has fallen, but the routes, money, weapons, and factions he left behind remain, and the violent battle to control them may prove even harder to stop.